right. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, evening, everyone. We are 1 minute away to get started. We'll just wait for a few more minutes to have everyone on board. Sparsh, you should go on mute. Yeah, thanks. A few more minutes. Those of you who already joined, let's make the chat a little interactive. Just type in, where you're joining from, so that we could know which parts of the world that you're from. Awesome. India, there's quite a few Indias, and Austria. Let's go. All right, I think we are 1 minute. We can start. Cool. All right, thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to the 4th episode of Voices of Community and the first edition of 2023. And as I've been posting on LinkedIn, it couldn't get any better than having Tariq, who's an expert in the field, has been very well known in the testing and the QA space, and has given a keynote across a lot of conferences, and specializes in a very niche area. Tariq, thanks for joining us. It's an honor to have you as part of Voice of Community.
Oh yeah, thanks for inviting me, Manoj.
Cool. For those of you who don't know Tariq King, he has over 15 years of experience in the software engineering and testing, and has donned many hats in the past. Chief scientist, head of quality, director of quality engineering, manager of software engineering, and then test architect. It seems like he's truly an industry expert who can bring in a lot of perspectives and his insights onto today's title. It's all about the technology trends for 2023. Tariq, with that, I will actually pass it over to you.
Sure, thank you, Manoj. Let me just share my screen.
Yeah.
Go from there. Share the desktop. All right. So yeah, again, an honor to be here as part of this edition of the Voices of Community. As Manoj said, like I've spent my years in many different roles, primarily surrounded by quality engineering and testing. But I just look at that as a broader kind of scope of doing engineering the right way. And everyone that knows me know I don't really talk about the future much. So this, even in itself, is probably a little bit unexpected. But with a title like this, I guess you have to kind of expect that. So the agenda will be kind of just going through the motivation for this talk in general, and then getting into a year-end review, 2021, 2022, and then talking about these trends. But it'll be a little bit of a different spin on it. At some points, I'll be going back to the future, because as a lot of these kind of forecasting things go, sometimes we're ahead of the curve in our future thinking. And it's sometimes good to realize, like, hey, where have we talked about this before in the past? Is this really something new, or was it kind of back then before its time and where it is now? And then the other key takeaway from it is actually just looking at the engineering perspectives, looking at how these trends really impact us as engineering organizations, individuals, teams, as we move forward. Whether or not you be an entire large enterprise or a small startup, there's impact. And then wrap it up just with a call to like how we can kind of navigate future uncertainty. All right, so we've had a few rough years, I think, in terms of after 2020 dealing with COVID. We were suffering with the coronavirus outbreak. COVID itself also intersected with, at times, was a catalyst for the development of, several digital technologies and new ways of doing things. But before we get into like the tech behind it, let's first briefly talk about some of the things that we had to lean into to try to figure out a bit more of as a result of COVID, in particular, if we're, again, talking about individuals or organizations or even as a society. So, of course, remote working had been a thing for some before COVID, but the pandemic really made it widespread, no pun intended there. As organizations and as leaders, we figured out a lot about how to manage hybrid workforces and remote workers. And as leaders, we ourselves had to figure out how to kind of stay connected and help others be connected when working remotely. More recently, we're navigating the world of, return to the office for some people while some others stay at home. And really, there's a lot of logistical, technical, and even interpersonal issues that we've had to navigate there. Now we're understanding that there's not only challenges related to working from home or sort of remote work, but this digital workplace also brings increased flexibility, lower operational expenses, and in many cases, even productivity gains, increased collaboration, and so on and so forth. Of course, with a health crisis, you can expect an impact on healthcare, but particularly the world of telemedicine and the professional healthcare industry really went beyond just kind of tolerating healthcare, remote healthcare, I should say, to it being widely accepted. And, once we start getting into that, we start thinking about like, hey, what are some of the advances that we can use to not only at that time contain the pandemic, but actually move us forward in this world of telemedicine as we embrace it. Of course, online learning was a thing for many, and it still continues to be. And I think there's value there in some of the advances that we've had moving forward. But more importantly, I think we've just had to learn to see like, hey, what really works well for this? What kinds of interactions are we missing out on? And how can we leverage technology to actually improve this sort of remote learning experience? And of course, it wasn't all about challenges. There were some things that for mental breaks, we actually started doing more of, in particular, gaming, right? And the gaming world and things like virtual reality. Those areas actually took an uptick from the pandemic and are booming and continue to boom. And we can think that they will probably continue in that way as we move forward. But people want to have this more immersive experience. They want to escape from their problems. They want to do something fun and connect with others, even if they can't be physically together. All right, so let's talk about the technology. I think the theme that pushed everything was that there was remote everything, right? And with the push towards that remote everything, we needed to stay connected. And so it shouldn't be surprising that the first tech that we're going to talk about is related to connectivity, right? 5G, over the last 2 years, there's been the rollout of the 5th generation of wireless data networks, and that has matured globally, right? And this is important because although there's many advantages to 5G over previous generations when it comes to higher speed, larger capacity, lower latency, one of the key challenges with 5G is that because it uses a higher frequency band, it is actually covering a smaller area in terms of the signal reach, right? And so therefore, there's more base stations that need to be built to spread 5G, which of course takes time. However, we've already seen a lot of tests and the ability of 5G networks to support a far greater number of devices per a given area, which is good for continuing the movement towards the Internet of Things, right? And so IoT connectivity has definitely improved using 5G, even though there's been other connectivity improvements, Wi-Fi 6 and low power wide area networks and so on and so forth. But the adoption of IoT has grown. It's not just about connectivity. Some thought things like wearables. There was mixed kind of views on wearables. Some thought that smartwatches and wristbands would replace laptops and smartphones, but they haven't, and most likely won't because of the limited utility there. And there were others who kind of thought, hey, maybe these technologies are on the way out. But one thing that like the last few years have forced us to do is to actually figure out the use cases where certain technologies are applicable and useful. And so, things like wearables, like smartwatches, are still thriving in healthcare, for example, in tracking patient health and automatic alerts and things like that. And similarly, we had different feelings about extended reality. And, again, some thought these were on the way out, and then COVID hit, and all of a sudden there was a greater need and even a push towards having these technologies be even better. And so we've therefore continued to see progress in IoT, smart homes, smart cities, and so on and so forth. And we're continuing to kind of look at how we can continue to develop these things in terms of the user experience, and especially things like performance, which kind of brings us to another focus area and steps a little bit into engineering. So one area that has gained quite a bit of attention is the idea of edge computing, which is really about bringing the computation and storage closer to the source of the data, normally referred to as the edge of the network, right? So to kind of break it down simpler, we're talking about running fewer processes in the cloud and moving them closer to local places such as the user's computer or IoT device, or even special edge networks. And by moving the computation to that periphery or edge of the network, we're minimizing the long distance communication that happens typically, right? So this is more of an architectural concern, but definitely being something that is impacting the way that we think about developing distributed systems. All right, so of course we can't recap without talking about AI and machine learning. And so while there have been several developments in AI with respect to big data and analytics and so on, one of the most kind of impactful things within the last year or two has been kind of the rise of generative AI, right? And when we talk about generative AI, we're talking about AI systems that can create things, in quotation marks, things such as pictures or audio or writing samples. And so we've been able to get AI to generate photos, compose music, write poems and news articles. And that's really cool technology. And the thing about it is that we're getting actually pretty good at kind of getting the machines to be able to do so in such a way that we actually can't tell the difference. In other words, we're getting really good at fooling ourselves. And one of the key areas where this was kind of a boom for in 2021 and 22 is the area of generative adversarial networks, right? And so there's generally two parts of this, right? There's generative AI, which, as we previously mentioned, creates things, right? And then there's discriminative AI, which is able to identify things like people in pictures or words and distinguish them from what is real and what is fake, right? And so with GANs, you're talking about using a generative model to do something like synthesize like a photo, like a human face. And then part of the process uses random noise so that we get some variability in that output. But then we pass those generated photos along with the real photos that we use to train the model to see if another model, which is called the discriminator, can actually determine which is real and which is fake, right? And so the whole idea here is that this exercise works from both sides to train both models. They get better at their respective tasks. So the discriminator gets better at identifying fakes, and then the generator gets better at creating more realistic photos, right? So the idea of using these machines to kind of compete against themselves, to make them better, has been a huge win for the last two years, especially. And so we've seen the rise of these GANs, and they're pretty impressive, right? None of these people on the screen actually exist. They're all generated by GANs. And, for a long time, the Turing tests used to be the gold standard for proving machine intelligence, right? Can we actually fool the human being? to know whether or not this is a machine or if this is real. And this new generation of bots is definitely giving Turing a run for his money. All right, another foundational generative AI approach that we have to kind of talk about, it just can't be talked about without thinking about this last year and now early 2023, is the idea of generative pre-trained transformers, right? So unless you've been sequestered on a private island somewhere without internet, you've probably heard about OpenAI's GPT-3, or more recently, the popular ChatGPT. But in a nutshell, transformers are this type of neural network architecture. And since as early as 2021, we've been really good at using neural nets to do things like identify objects, right? To do computer vision tasks. And there's optimized neural networks architectures for that, convolutional neural networks, which kind of loosely mimic the way that the human brain processes vision. But we've never really had something that's equally good or comparably good to analyze text. And this is where transformers come in. There's very popular transformers like BERT, GPT-3, as we'll mention and talk about. But this is the idea, right? And of course, ChatGPT just took about 5 days to reach 1 million users, right? Which is pretty impressive with, thinking about, historically, things like Instagram took 2.5 months, or Facebook took 10 months to get to that level, and Netflix 3.5 years. So we're kind of seeing like, hey, this swarming and this rapid adoption. But ChatGPT is really a specialized variant of GPT-3, specifically designed to generate natural language responses to questions in conversation. And so it uses the GPT-3 architecture, but has been optimized for conversational text. And this is important because, again, GPT-3 is not necessarily even new. It's the 3rd generation, as it indicates there, of generative pre-trained transformers. But that's more of a broad language model. And to give you some idea of the size, is that model has 175 billion parameters. And so it's very powerful, able to do many more things. And in general, like how these transformers started out was doing things like language translation, right? But of course, we've seen through this technology, the ability to generate text and to answer these questions very well, or even to summarize things and just kind of speed up and really improve the way that we interact with AI. All right, another key advancement in 2022, especially, again, a lot triggered by the pandemic, is kind of pushing towards this extended reality, right? So virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. And, this has been pretty cool to see. A large range of devices now come on the market. Meta announced their Meta Quest Pro, which, again, is kind of pricey, but is a game changer in some respects. And then we're now seeing other similar headsets on the market as well, that are bringing us deeper, closer, solving challenges. Physically wearing these things can be typically a challenge for some of us, I know. And we're seeing that get addressed, and we're moving closer and closer. All right, CGI is something that has gone hand in hand with that. Some of the biggest announcements of the year were, again, by Epic Games with their Unreal Engine 5, which was a lot of breakthroughs in rendering technologies and the way that we can kind of build these virtual worlds and even virtual humans or meta-humans. Meta also had their AI-based codec avatars that they kind of brought in a lot of these lifelike movements. But the whole idea here is that, like, even with CGI, you're starting to see, like, hey, it's becoming really, really difficult to determine whether or not this is computer generated or if this is a real human being. And combine that with thinking about AI, we've seen a lot of deep fakes and so on and so forth come up that kind of are slightly entertaining and also slightly disturbing when we start thinking about potential dangers. All right, so we also have the world of crypto, of course, Bitcoin kind of leading the pack there, but when we start to think about payment systems that use cryptography, this is kind of like this world where, unlike traditional currency, we get value from crypto, from the proof of the transactions and how they're verified on the blockchain. And that has been very, very attractive to some, especially from an investment standpoint. Others are using it more traditionally for payments. But nonetheless, these have been technologies that have been quite prevalent in our minds. And in particular, the blockchain technology, which kind of decentralizes and has this kind of public digital ledger. And again, starting off with financial and payments, but we've seen the application of blockchain spread in the last 2 years to things like monitoring supply chains or digital IDs, data sharing, copyrights and royalty protections, IoT network management, and in healthcare, right? And so there's no limits on these technologies, it seems, when it comes to impacting a broad domain of various domains. And that's kind of like has been the power all the way from AI and machine learning or any kind of really emerging technologies is an ability to be applied to different problems. And just to round that up, also NFTs, also thinking about how do you start to move towards these non-fungible tokens that, again, are these cryptographic tokens that exist on the blockchain, not easy to be replicated. And we've seen innovations here around NFTs, right? So in addition to representing real world items like artwork or real estate, we've also seen AI-powered intelligent tokens, or these INFTs, come up, which now have intelligence and are scalable and interactive, using NFTs for audio, gaming ecosystems, which enable gamers to earn income by bringing these financial mechanisms to games, right? So again, a wide range of things that we've been seeing throughout the last 2 years. All right, but it's not all about technological advances. We've seen that we're in a season of uncertainty. And as we are coming out of the pandemic and things are looking up, then we're hit with immense geopolitical tension and economic turmoil. And I think for many of us, we're trying to figure out, like, are we on the road to recession? Are we on the road to recovery? And it's like, we don't know which way we're headed. But one thing was for sure in the tech world that we are feeling and have felt last year, which was for many reasons, we've seen these mass layoffs, right? And again, when you have this kind of economic turmoil, companies are going to move into a different mode, and we've all been impacted by it. There's not anyone that's not affected or doesn't know someone who's been impacted by it in the tech world. And it's really something that, again, I think drives as a core part of the motivation for me to even kind of talk about this stuff that we're talking about today. Because as we look at technological advances in the last 2 years, as we start to think about the future, how does this all fit together, and how can we best actually prepare ourselves in these times, right? All right, so let's get back to the future, right? So we haven't actually talked about the future. We've talked a lot about, what has happened in the last 2 years and the impacts of the pandemic before that. But what is on the horizon for 2023, right? Especially in the technology space. Of course, again, I'm not a person that normally talks about forecasting what will happen. Is not a thing that I normally do. There's analysts for that, right? And Gartner came out with their top strategic technology trends for 2023 last year in November. And, I follow these things as many of you do. And in thinking about some of them, what I wanted to do with this talk about expecting the unexpected is actually analyze some of those and then put them in the perspective of what is not so new here, and then exactly how does it actually impact us, or where have we seen these things before, and then what can we actually expect from them if they do come to fruition. All right, so one of the first concepts there was the idea of digitally immune systems, which is really about continuous protection. And, again, this is not really anything that I thought was like super new. I just kind of see a lot of things coming together, right? But the whole idea here is that you want to design and build applications and services to make them more resilient so that they can recover quickly from failures. And so there's a lot of key elements here: observability, site reliability engineering, software supply chain security, chaos engineering, and most importantly, this idea of auto remediation, which is just a fancy way of saying self-healing and building self-healing systems. Not talking about self-healing selectors that we all like to talk about in the testing world, but systems that can actually analyze and diagnose issues that might be happening in the runtime and coming up with a fix for these things, right? And kind of hand in hand with that, which was also in Gartner's list, was the idea of kind of AI-powered tests or AI augmented tests, which for me, I like to refer to as AI-driven testing. But a key part of that is like, hey, we leverage the power of AI to be able to do some of these things at runtime, right? Self-healing and so on and so forth. And this is where it hit me, for example, like, yeah, this is really a back to the future moment, because I remember when I was in college and the idea of autonomic computing I was doing in grad school. It was probably 2005, but back in as early as 2000, IBM came up with this idea of autonomic computing, right? Which was looking at the future of computing being systems that can self-configure, self-optimize, self-heal, and self-protect. And I remember as a student in grad school, for me, I was like, well, hey, what happened to testing? And my dissertation actually focused around the integration of a self-testing, intrinsic self-testing capability into these types of systems, and actually looking at how can we develop autonomous agents that actually not only do this kind of self-healing and self-protection and these things, but actually do self-testing as part of that workflow. And so as we talk about auto remediation and AI augmented testing and so on and so forth, like that comes to my mind. We've seen this before, and we've been talking about this as much as a decade ago. And then another key trend there from Gartner was the idea of adaptive AI. So we saw that generative AI in the past 2 years was a big thing. Adaptive AI, which again, is kind of reminiscent of even the autonomic computing era, right? We're talking about systems that can respond to changes in their environment, right? But now we're kind of focused on the learning aspects of this. Like these systems can actually add to the limited training data that they have, and then even personalize generalized results. So this kind of, here's your goal, here's the feedback, and then here's how we adapt to that learning as a cycle. And so, these are not necessarily new things. I think what has happened is that the technology has gotten to the point where we can actually realize some of these dreams, right? And so from an engineering perspective, when we think about adaptive AI, we have to recognize that we're moving towards a place where we have to be able to do machine learning operations, or ML ops. Sometimes people refer to it as AI ops, but we're talking about the continuous integration, deployment, continuous learning and testing of these AI systems, right? And so from an engineering standpoint, we need to be ready for that. And specifically to talk about testing, I believe that the next shift that we're going to see is inward, right? Similar to that concept of self-testing, we'd be talking about shifting left and shifting right to production. I think we need to focus more on how do we actually design systems that they can test themselves. And it should be no surprise then that after talking about all this adaptive AI, like one of the next trends is like, hey, how do we get to a place where we can actually trust or analyze risk or actually do security management, right? And so Gartner kind of coined this AI TRISM acronym to refer to these things. And, in taking a step backward first, even before thinking about us getting to a place where we really trust these things, I think the first thing in my mind is that AI has to become believable. And that's exactly what we're seeing these days with ChatGPT. We're seeing AI be very visible, very usable, comprehensible. because we've had a challenge with marketing around AI and actually believing that there is AI and it can actually do something different and beyond what we're capable of with computers these days. And I think once we get to the believable stage, even as engineering teams, we're going to start seeing more of AI being leveraged for software engineering, in addition to other things, right? AI for requirements analysis, code reviews, code generation. Many of these things are ongoing already, and projects that are out there, and startup companies or companies that have invested heavily in leveraging AI technology for this. But it first starts with us actually knowing the capabilities and believing that this stuff is actually useful and out there, right? And then from a quality engineering standpoint, we need to be able to bring all that testers bring to the table to the world of AI and machine learning, because testers bring this big picture, right? It is not just about data science or AI ML engineering. It's about the end user. It's about the testing process. It's about operations, cybersecurity, et cetera, and data science, and those other methods that are being used to construct the system. All right, so the fourth trend that I want to touch on is this idea of super apps. And in this context, like a super app is really a mobile application that provides a set of personal and commercial services in one self-contained ecosystem. So we're talking about several mini apps. There's a lot of different definitions out there about what should be part of a super app to call it super. Some super apps aren't that super, but things like social utility or community, financial services, retail, e-commerce, that sort of stuff, delivery or transport, and then of course, payments and so on. So if this seems a little familiar and maybe you're having the reaction that, here we go again, run for the hills, another repeat of history, it's because these things have actually been very successful in Asia. Commonly cited super apps are things like WeChat, Alipay, Line, Grab. And, you know, we're talking about something like WeChat, for example, expanding from a messaging app into an e-commerce platform. And Grab is actually a very well-known and leading super app that's serving Southeast Asia. And we're talking about 8 countries, things like deliveries, mobility, financial services, and more than 670 million people leveraging this technology. And so that's notable. And there's different factors, and I don't really want to necessarily get into like, hey, is this going to actually happen? Because super apps don't really exist in the US yet, but there's some Western apps that are trying to build. And I think you've seen these things, right? You started to see Uber already has grocery and ticket marketplaces, and they're expanding into health-related services. And so as we kind of step into this world of these super apps are coming, we really need to think that the success of these things actually depend a lot on the engineering side. And, you know, as someone who's spent their career in quality engineering, I know how important it is to have a seamless and secure user journey, right, and user experience. And so, you know, super app development, and I put there including performance, we really need to figure out how to build these kind of composable apps, because once you start combining these semi-related services or mini apps together, there's undoubtedly an impact on the operational speed and responsiveness. And when you couple that with today's world where the short attention span of users could really start to cause loyal users to move to other platforms, other competing platforms, because they're more performant. And, you know, we don't talk about it much, but performance can be a big differentiator. And so I think super app engineering teams or engineering owners must balance this desire to bring these new services and stuff with the operational overhead that's caused by doing that, and have a clear focus on, in particular, platform engineering, which coincidentally is called out specifically as a tech trend for 2023 as well. But if you've ever led a platform engineering team, you know that a well-designed, highly reusable, composable, and extensible platform allows you to deliver the right capabilities to users with as little overhead as possible, including things like building self-service and having a uniform user experience. So it helps you to kind of get there. So I believe in 2023, we'll see more focus on platform engineering, including composable architectures, platform as a service, and tying all that together with DevOps, SRE, monitoring, and so on and so forth. So again, from the engineering standpoint, this means that cloud native technologies are here to stay. Containers, service meshes, microservices, immutable infrastructure, etc., aren't going anywhere. And what does that mean for individuals in this space? Well, I expect to see a lot more focus on developer-focused quality engineering and testing. In particular, I like to talk about shift-left developer testing, right? So we're, in general, with shift-left, we're talking about shifting testing to the left of the project like timeline, doing testing earlier and more frequently. From a developer's perspective, you can see here in this graphic that I've laid out almost all aspects of testing to kind of be a part of this developer focus, right? And this is really intentional in trying to start to break down the silos between development and testing. So any part of continuous testing, continuous validation and verification needs to think about testing as a design tool, testing by looking, static analysis, unit testing, and so on and so forth. All right, so the final trend that I want to talk about before we kind of move into how to navigate is the metaverse. And in particular, there's been a lot of hype, a lot of talk about the metaverse. Of course, the metaverse doesn't actually exist yet, this single iteration of the internet, and a lot of aspects of virtual reality and augmented reality are coming into play here. But how do you actually even start to build the metaverse, right? And you have to start thinking that because this thing doesn't exist, there needs to be ways that we can leverage techniques to help us discover and iterate over what is actually required. I love this saying as part of a set of design principles is that software engineering and software design is a wicked problem. And the characteristics of a wicked problem is that you actually can't define the problem properly until you start solving it. And so I think that when it comes to metaverse design, we're going to see a lot of the need for acceptance-driven test design or designing the metaverse for testability, because testing can be used as the kind of the headlights of the project to help guide it and shine lights on risk and then feed it right back into the process. Of course, from a development standpoint and architecture, for those of you who are familiar with John Radoff, he's an entrepreneur, author, and game designer. He's talked a lot about the development of the metaverse and things surrounding Web 3.0. And there's these 7 layers of the metaverse that he's discussed. And if you look at a lot of these things, we've already covered a lot of these technologies, everything from 5G to mobile, IoT, et cetera, edge computing. And so there's an alignment with the metaverse in everything that we've even talked about over the last 2 years. And again, I think COVID being the catalyst, me personally, I've got the pleasure of embarking on missions where I've leveraged AI and machine learning for testing these different metaverse elements, things like leveraging AI for digital avatar testing, right? And we're talking about testing now the look and feel of these different digital avatars or customizations, and now moving into the world of actually being able to automatically test conversations, right? And again, it opens up a lot. But then other hard problems like video quality testing that will come into play. How good the user experience is in the metaverse will determine on how immersed you are and how realistic things actually feel. Testing the open world, right? Leveraging things like reinforcement learning to help navigate the open world and achieve different goals, right? And so things like hierarchical reinforcement learning are a key aspect of that. And we're seeing these areas of AI continue to develop. And then, of course, tying all of that in with virtual reality and extended reality like AR and MR. So if you start to think about AI for testing the metaverse, again, a lot of things also have to come together, and that has generally been a theme of things to come, right? All of these things that we've seen for the last 2 years, all of these technologies are now driving towards a new iteration of the internet, which means they, by definition, become the future. All right, so when we start talking about technology, it gets all exciting, and we can kind of feel like if we're looking at this through the lens of rose-colored glasses. And as we know, 2023 is not rose-colored. There's still a lot of economic turmoil. There's still a lot of uncertainty. And as we see that, we can expect that companies are going to continue to cut costs. It's inevitable that that's going to happen. So layoffs will continue. Maybe some businesses might not survive, just as we've been seeing in the past. But that doesn't mean that like all is lost, right? There's other ways that companies may try to cut costs that might impact both negatively and positively, right? Trending towards more open source software to avoid getting deep into software licensing. But also then thinking about innovation and automation. So it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe if someone has built something new and innovative, it might be worth the licensing costs to get that thing if it's going to really help move us forward. So there's kind of this balance. And of course, these things aren't separate either. You can certainly build innovative tools off of open source software and keep it open source. But then in general, just looking at efficiency, right? Life cycle and process improvement across the board, and seeing things like managed services or even outsourcing become part of the ways that businesses tend to optimize. And again, this doesn't have to necessarily be all focused on the gloom and doom of replacing labor, but there's benefits to investing in process improvement and making organizations more operationally efficient. And one of the famous things that I like to quote here, that a close friend of mine said, is that constraints bring innovation, right? And that is true. When we're squeezed like this, it brings us kind of together in a different way. All right, so how do we actually start to navigate this uncertainty, whether you're a business or individual? The first thing I would say is that knowing that, you know, unexpected things can happen, you have to try to be prepared. And that sounds almost like an oxymoron in itself. Like, how can you be prepared for something that's, you don't know what's really going to happen? And the idea is that you don't want anything to catch you by surprise. So you want to be strategic in everything, right? As you go through and you think about doing something, you have to be able to look forward, critically analyze pros and cons, things that could happen, even if there's not a high probability of them happening, and try to make sure that you have that strategic planning. And, you know, I was reading an article the other day with some statistics, and it says like something like 80% of organizations in tech say that their organization has been very deficient when it comes to strategy and long-term thinking. And that was very surprising. Now, whether or not that statistic is true is another story, but that was very surprising to me to have a survey come back and have that, you know, be the result. So being strategic is key. And then coupled with that, being fearless, right? And knowing that, hey, if you prepare yourself, if you look forward and, you know, whatever happens, you just have to kind of face it head on and move forward. And one of the most famous quotes that I like to reference when it starts talking about expecting the unexpected, well, there's two. There's one that's kind of in the description about that being a modern way of thinking. But there's another one that says, like, no matter what, you want to expect the unexpected. So you need to be strategic in that sense. And whenever possible, be the unexpected. So in thinking about that, you want to think about individual investment in yourself to be prepared, or in your organization. You want to think about being a disruptor and a game changer, and being that person or that organization or that entity that is the unexpected thing that happens in a positive way, right? And it is by that, you know, like we talk about strategy, and it's often kind of criticized because it's kind of things are happening so fast that we can't anticipate the future. But in reality, nothing great was never really accomplished without a strategy, right? And in a constantly changing market, strategy is the best way to actually deal with the unexpected. And strategic thinking and critical thinking are often underrated, in my opinion. So I would encourage you, as you navigate this world, as you think about tech, as you think about your personal situation, your personal life, your job, your career, your business, that you take that into mind that, hey, you want to try to expect these unexpected things to happen, prepare for them, be strategic in your thinking, and then where possible, be the disrupting force, right? And so with that, just want to thank you, and we can open up for questions.
Awesome. That was fantastic, Tariq. Thank you so much. I think personally, I've learned a lot. Starting from, I think most of you would have heard about the OSI 7 layers, probably in the university days. And now that we have a 7 layers, in Metaverse, which in itself, we can see how technology has evolved. Yeah, this is amazing. I think before we step into the Q&A, I think first things first, Tariq, how do you get so much information about all this technology? If someone wants to know about all these things, is there a place to go and look for this information, or what are the sources of your such informations?
Yeah, I mean, you could see there. There's a lot of sources, right? I mean, especially if you're thinking about looking forward, I always recommend that, follow like some of what the analysts are saying. That's why I decided to even include like the Gartner report as part of this talk. But then you'll also see that there's a lot of analysis there and a lot of things that just kind of come from being in tune with the community and what is happening in the different disciplines, right? There's no easy way to know everything, but kind of keeping track of emerging technologies is key, right? So what's new? I always ask myself every week, at least for some portion, what is new in blockchain? What is new in NFT? What is going on in the metaverse, right? And I'm not actually very good at it. I got inspired from a colleague of mine that every day he would tell me about some new trend in AI. He was a machine learning engineer, and he would literally come and tell me about these new trends or this paper that he read. And I was like, man, this kid must be reading these things all night, because I know he's working during the day. And of course, we create space for him to learn these things during working hours, but it was just so much that it felt like, hey. So I always tell people the internet is out there. There's many avenues. There's the community. There's courses. Keep abreast with what is happening in tech. And then also from a leadership standpoint, and even from just a human impact and emotional intelligence standpoint, which is a passion of mine as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tariq. I think most of you, I'm sure this would have been the top of the question for all of you who's listening into it, and I have the opportunity to ask that. All right, we have a couple of questions, Tariq. Let's pick up. I think one of the questions is from Matthew. His question is, how far are we from GAN application in the video domain? DeepMind DVD GAN is tackling this, but I think it's really tricky, especially for the computational resources needed opposed to an image.
Yeah. I mean, so you'll see like research when it comes to GANs and practice, there's sometimes a little bit of a separation. But of course, like you mentioned, one of the key challenges is how do you do this like real-time processing and have the machines actually train and give real-time feedback. This is a problem that we tackled a lot in trying to look at testing video games. Something, you can think about video game frameworks and tying into those things, but if you're just trying to do it from a purely visual standpoint and vision standpoint, it really requires a lot of optimized frameworks and optimization behind the scenes once you discover which models are useful and then try to tune them and so on and so forth. So how far are we from these things? I think, yes, these big companies are pushing these things. I think it becomes really hard, for example, like a startup company who's in this area, to have expectations that you will go and recreate what OpenAI and DeepMind and these folks are doing in a short space of time. So part of it really relies on how quickly these things become available to us, in addition to us doing our own R&D and looking at different ways to become efficient. but we see things improving all the time. Like we talked about some of the different techniques and edge computing and all these things that are also, when we start thinking about distributed processing, hey, there's a lot of opportunity for us to try different things to help to optimize computationally. And then of course, as processors get better, life will get better, so.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tariq. I hope that answered your question, Matthew. Feel free to put it up on the chat. The next question that I will pick up is related to the blockchain. I believe you touched upon it, but this is more from a perspective of what advancements that needs to be done to test the decentralized applications. Are we there yet? Are there any tools that you already know?
Yeah, so first thing to understand is like testing decentralized and distributed systems in general is a difficult thing, right? I remember as far back as being in school doing distributed processing and parallel processing courses, and just thinking about the complexity of the whole thing was hard. And then how do you actually test is one aspect of it. How do you actually then debug? And then how do you actually even get a view of the reporting and the health of these things once you actually figure out these scenarios, right? What I can say here with this is that there is a foundation of knowledge around testing distributed systems. It's not something that the testing community hasn't recognized as a hard problem, even from as early as thinking of parallel, before parallel processing, just thinking of multi-threaded applications. So there's stuff there, right? Now, in terms of testing blockchain specifically, I do and have seen some content. A former colleague of mine, Diony Santiago, created a tutorial at one point on testing the blockchain, and I've seen others follow suit since. So I can probably find and even share that material. But what I can say in terms of tooling is that folks are tackling it and tools are coming up. I haven't personally dabbled enough to see any tooling, especially around testing the blockchain, that I can say like, hey, like this is out there. But yeah, if anyone knows, feel free. Again, there's a whole point of community, right? Feel free to chime in there, because I think it is a worthwhile investment, and we'll see more of it. As I mentioned, like all of these things are coming together into this whole metaverse dream. But regardless, we're seeing it being applied right now to many different areas. And so testing always becomes, as we see this kind of adoption, testing, even though it usually is like an afterthought for many, testing usually then becomes of utmost importance once things start to fail, unfortunately. So.
Amazing. Thanks, Tariq. That was really pragmatic. I think before getting into the other question, it's just a conversation that I need to have. So Tariq, you have been seeing all the QAs around in the community, be it different conferences or having a chat with them over LinkedIn or any social media for that matter. There's been an ongoing conversation about testing web applications and then mobile applications. That has been the most conversation that I've seen also in conferences, which is also one of the reasons why I see these topics are getting repetitive in the conferences, is a fact that not many people getting enough chance to work on AI, the metaverse, and all the new technology that that you have put together now. If someone wants to work on this as a, say, as a part-time project, or an I have some time to do some open source work, so maybe let's pick something around the decentralized system and how can I work on it. So long story short, the question is more around how is there any resources, or how can I find an opportunity? Because not every time, in professional environment, at my work, at my project, I might not have the pleasure of working on all this new tech. As a commoner, is there a place where I can find this, or how do you recommend for those people? Other than reading articles is great, but what's beyond that? Like, I really need to get my hands on. If that's my question, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, so this is my general advice that I give to folks who want to venture into new areas. Again, because of my former position, a lot of that people ask, for example, the best example is AI and machine learning. And you're right, like learning getting knowledge, I should say, right, from reading articles or whatever, only goes so far. And it's usually the real learning and the creativity and the innovation happens once you start to actually put hands to keyboard. So my advice is usually, and I wish I could say that there was a good place where people are actually posting projects in a marketplace, but that doesn't happen very frequently. But I know that there are some companies that are very active in the community and push things out there. But I always tell people, like, the first thing is that you need to be able to find the resources to help you with the information that you need to drive the hands-on engagement, right? But before that, you need a problem to work on, right? So figure out the problem. In terms of like AI and machine learning, I always tell people, make sure that this is a problem that you should be solving with AI. Let it be something relevant. But in terms of actually getting your hands on, I found that, like, for example, in the machine learning world, there's a site called machinelearningmastery.com, which that site is all about applied machine learning. So it's not really a lot of theoretical stuff. It's all a lot of hands-on pieces where there's code that's available. There's now tooling that's becoming a lot easier to just pick up and use. Of course, the world has been taken abreast by like ChatGPT, and now everyone can kind of use it and interact with it. But finding sites where you can actually put hands to keyboard and has the information to help you set up environments or maybe pull down containers or leverage infrastructure, right? That is kind of on demand and stuff like that. Like, that is a good way to even get started, right? And I know at LambdaTest, for example, like one of the goals that y'all have is to kind of simplify a lot of that behind the scenes stuff, right? And that's exactly kind of what we actually need to be able to do to get started hands-on. Is first recognizing that it's not that everything has to be built up from scratch. There's a lot of things out there that you can provision automatically and pull down. Again, in the machine learning world, there's Jupyter notebooks and all these things that you can just start, right? So I would advise to anyone, look for the communities and the information that have access to what these things are, and then actually just start a project on your own, right? Or if someone is doing something, jump on in. Many times there's leaders and thought leaders out there that would love for someone to work on something. Approach them, like, be bold in your, pursuit of the knowledge and the experience. So I hope that helps to kind of answer that for you, Manoj.
Definitely. I think it definitely helps. And I think this is one of the common questions even that I usually get on the new tech whenever we talk about in any panel discussions about, AI, low code, no code, and all that. I think this definitely helps for all of them who's wanting to get into all the new tech stuff. Tariq, another thing that was more exciting for me when you mentioned about is the NFTs, right? And I think NFT has been there for a while, but what's even more interesting is the INFTs that you mentioned about. Is there anything you could share more about it? Like, I'm personally interested in looking at it, because when these things comes into any big tech organization implementing it for as an R&D project, and if if any QA is getting an opportunity to work on it, how should we tackle that? Because that's a problem, as you mentioned previously, that's the problem to tackle. So imagining that's a problem to tackle, how should you go about doing such things around NFT especially?
Yeah, so when I think about intelligence, right, and embedding intelligence into any technology, and in this case specifically like NFTs, it comes down to like and we mentioned in the presentation this idea of adaptive AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think of intelligence, like, usually a big thing that we think about in terms of being intelligent, besides having knowledge, is the ability to recognize a particular context and change and adapt, right? So with NFTs and embedding intelligence into them, I see a lot of applications there where you can start to look at tokens and tokenizing and trying to see, like, what can we do with the technology itself to make it more smarter and more adaptable to our needs, right? So again, a lot of this stuff stemmed off of like the crypto world, right? And the application thereof, right? And now we're seeing especially with non-fungible tokens, like, hey, properties, metaverse, like, validation, right? So think about how can we actually automate a lot of the processes and identification of opportunities by embedding intelligence into something, which means monitoring the environment, seeing what is going on, identifying a particular opportunity, and then being able to synthesize a plan for actually addressing that issue, right? So all of these things like self-configuration, self-healing, self-protection, all kind of come into play when you start to think about even NFTs and tokens and technology. So again, this is something very new, even for me. So I would say keep abreast on top of it and see what's happening there and stuff, right? I would also say, like, for example, one of the things that I thought was really forward thinking in terms of NFTs that we mentioned there was the GameFi thing, right? Thinking about how we can leverage this technology to actually create a new means of employment, right? I can now make money playing games, right? And so following those kind of things, again, I'm a gamer at heart, so I always think that, like, hey, there's going to be innovations there, and it usually is true. So looking at those kind of use cases and applying them is also a good thing to follow.
Awesome. Since you mentioned a gamer, I would like to ask, what's your favorite?
Oh, favorite. So my traditional favorite games have been things like FIFA, have been sports games from EA. So respect out to EA on that stuff. But in the past, it's been first-person shooters all the way back from like the Quake days, moving all the way forward to consoles and Halo and stuff like that. But nowadays, the most gaming that I get to do is on the Nintendo Switch. I'm playing Roblox with my daughters. so life has changed from all the high fidelity graphics, PS5, Xbox. All those things sit in my living room, but they just sit in my living room, and I rarely get to play them. And mostly in the metaverse, the Roblox metaverse and Fortnite metaverse, playing with my kids. So
amazing, absolutely. Perspectives, priorities, and expect the unexpected, right? So it's all about we have to gel with their world, not the actual world that we live in. All right, with that, beautiful smiles all around. Thank you so much, Tariq. Definitely, I don't know what's the highest or the longest meal that we say. I think as far as I know, it's a 12-course meal, but definitely a 12-course meal worth of food for thought for everyone who join us. And this will also be posted on YouTube for those of you who could not join us today for whatsoever reason. With that, thank you so much. Any last few words you want to share? Please feel free to share.
No, I just say thanks again to you, Manoj, and to LambdaTest again for even this Voices of Community program. I think it's great. I think everyone needs a chance to be heard, and especially we're going through a lot in the tech world. And so engagements like this and opportunities to discuss are of utmost importance. So thank you. And there's, everyone out there, keep on fighting the good fight and keep on moving tech forward for 2023.
Thank you. Thanks, Tariq. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'll see you in the next edition of Voice of Community in February. Until then, take care. See you all.
Bye, folks.
All right.